grass is cut and its smell rises twice. Travel. I went all across country, a sense of humor the size of farm animals. Two sentences. One, I'm trying to write a poem. Two, the broom is in the corner. So those are sort of the kind of things we were doing. And this is a little bit of context. It's called Going Electric. You remember that period when Dylan went electric. This is a very small scale. Recently, I reread copies of letters I wrote half a century ago as a young poet to several poet friends. Beginning in the spring of 1965 when I was 21 and trailing off less than 3 years later in the winter of 1967, the letters show, I think, a nascent sense of vocation, and then in the middle of the interim comes a cosmic interruption. I was invited to fly to Los Angeles to read for the part of Benjamin Braddock, the title role in Mike Nichols' new movie, The Graduate. This happened because my stepfather, Walter Matthau, had liked my performance in a school play and recommended me for the part to Nichols. The letters begin when Tom Clark, a young American poet living in England who had recently succeeded Donald Hall as the poetry editor of the Paris Review, came across a copy of Lines, the little magazine I was editing, and wrote asking if I could fill him in on the poetry scene in New York. While I hadn't met Clark, I knew and admired his poetry, which I'd seen in a recent issue of Poetry magazine. I was flattered to hear from him and happy to let him know about the group in New York that I was just beginning to get to know myself. Quote, first there's C, a magazine edited by Ted Berrigan, centered in the work of the New York School, Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, Kenneth Cope, and then the work of younger writers who've been much inspired by it, Ron Padgett, Berrigan, Richard Gallup. C has also published a lot of work by a poet who is not too easily reckoned into any group, or even any broad sense of poetry, Joe Charvolo. His lines have no literal sense sometimes, but make it absolutely as the marks of feeling, much as, say, Franz Klein does that, i.e. the line is not descriptive. The emphasis here, the line is not descriptive, was for me a mantra-like catch-all and a big part of what made things exciting. We wanted to surprise each other and ourselves. Our luck was that our closest predecessors were pathfinders, from Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg to Frank O'Hara and Denise Levertov, so that our immediate inheritance didn't involve battling entrenched powers that be. As far as we were concerned, that had already been taken care of. We were reading the writers who had done it, even if Time magazine was still arguing about the value of Howl or On the Road, and hadn't yet heard about lunch poems. As the year went by, Tom in England was increasingly worried about his draft status, a concern I'd shared myself not too long before. I wrote him in November, how do you feel about it? A year ago when I went down for my physical, if I hadn't been preceded by a letter from a psychiatrist eliminating me from the regular proceedings, my papers all stamped referred to chief, psychiatrist that is, so I was singled out and sent to a long line waiting for their interview. I wonder how I would have fared. I mean, I think anybody can get out if they're sure they want to get out. For instance, there was a small, solid Negro boy I saw take his eye test. They held up the giant E to him. And he said, I can't see it. They said, come on, stop fucking around. But he just sat there and said, no, man, can't see it. The orderly leaned down and asked him if he wanted to be in the Army. He said no, and they referred him right away to the chief line. I'm pretty sure he got out. That is, the chief was an old, nice man, and anybody who looked out of it probably got out. I sat down and stared out his window. I'd heard it was a schizoid trait not to look at him when he was speaking or when I spoke. He finally asked me if I wanted to be in the Army. I said no. And he said, what is it, fear? I said, no, I just don't think I can make it in the Army. Well, he said, I don't think we should force you. Wow. I knew I was lucky with the letter and with him. Tom had chosen poems by several of us in New York for publication in the Paris Review, and he'd interviewed Allen Ginsberg for the magazine's Writers at Work series. I went out to Hollywood and read for Mike Nichols and was asked to be prepared for a callback to take a screen test at any moment. Apparently he thought I might be a good match for the part. Later that summer, I abandoned my apartment on West 85th Street after 10 months, breaking a year's lease, and took a plane to London. My father, a bachelor in his late 50s, had rented a one-bedroom apartment at Whiteland's house, an apartment building just off the King's Road in Chelsea. My sister Lucy was camped out on one of the living room sofas, and I camped out on another one while Pop had the bedroom. I met Tom soon after arriving. A tall, handsome Chicago native, he was a teaching fellow under Donald Davy at the University of Essex, a train ride away, and often came to London. Over the next 2 months, I also visited him a couple of times for an overnight at his tract house in Brightlingsea. I see now that he was a literary wonderkind and at the same time a veritable workhorse. Not only was he choosing poetry for the Paris Review, he was simultaneously and single-handedly editing and publishing on an office Mimeo machine at Essex that he had after-hours access to, a series of one-shot magazines with the successive titles Once, Twice, Thrice, Thrice, Nice, Spice. A phenomenal feat accomplished in scarcely a year's time. While troubled by his draft status, which remained up in the air, he had an easygoing, funny side, no doubt bolstered by the marijuana or hashish that was daily fare. This was the last time I would share quarters with my father and the scene of my fondest memories of him. He was in a decidedly lion in winter phase, and there were copies of Faber paperbacks of his early short story collections around the apartment, books I took to reading with great enjoyment. It seemed to me that they were like the 1930s equivalent of what the current Bob Dylan albums were for my generation. I brought along my portable Royal typewriter from New York and set up at the living room table, was writing a lot of minimal poems. In something of an apocalyptic mood about the unfolding 60s, I must have been at best a mixed blessing to my gifted parent. My late sister Lucy liked to tell the story of how one afternoon she and Pop were in the bedroom when I exclaimed from my table in the living room, "This is the greatest poem I've ever written." "Did you hear the typewriter?" Pop asked Lucy. By very quickly. On his own typewriter, he was working on the text for a collection of photographs by the life photographer Arthur Rothstein. And from time to time, I got to read a page or two. On each manuscript page was a single block paragraph, and while I expressed admiration, I wasn't sure that these had the same verb as the early stories. Back in America that fall, I moved into a 2-story row house on Watson Street in Central Square in Cambridge, a house shared with several roommates, including eventually the poet Clark Coolidge. One day in the mail, I received a copy of Pop's book with Arthur Rothstein and opened it without much anticipation. The text of each paragraph was set on a page opposite the photograph that had inspired it, and it had been broken into multiple paragraphs, each piece a kind of prose sculpture that he had carved out of the first draft blocks I'd seen in London. So the devil-may-care William Saroyan of the 1930s, who, so the legend ran, never revised, had yielded to the master craftsman I saw in the published book. When Clark Coolidge moved into the house, he and I commenced a daily dialogue about the direction our poetry was taking. Clark's work a kind of literary abstract expressionism, while I worked at minimal or concrete poetry. And these conversations must have helped to shore up my sense of having found a vocation. It had been a year now since I'd read for Mike Nichols in Hollywood. Ron Paget and his pregnant wife, Pat, had left New York and they were living in Tulsa, their hometown, awaiting the birth of their child. In December 1966, I wrote Ron, "I've given up pot and drugs in general. They don't work very well in the end. I'm too ambitious to be spaced out. I don't think I'm going to go to Hollywood. I'll know very soon. They've been calling again." And suddenly I realized I don't have any desire to make a Hollywood movie, be a movie star or whatever I would be. What would I do in that world? I'm an American poet. I'm working on something and have been for years. It's been a distraction. I'd like to be recognized for my work, not for theirs. The pivotal decision happened within the week. I declined the screen test from the studio phone to set up another flight out to LA. A few months later came a remarkable, fateful turn of the wheel. In fact, several of them. It began with Ted Berrigan's spring visit to Cambridge on his way to Lowell to interview Jack Kerouac for the Paris Review. Knowing Jack's admiration for my father's work, he invited me along. Clark, a big Kerouac fan, had meanwhile moved out of Watson Street and gone to San Francisco, where he became the drummer in David and Tina Meltzer's rock band, The Serpent Power. A day or two after the interview, I wrote him, "I think Ted has a genius for coordinating a work, so look for that Paris Review." Late in the night, Kerouac, Ted, and I read each other our poems. Kerouac was thrilled I was Saroyan's son, and for once I was thrilled. I think I was thrilled too. It was the least I could do. Before leaving Cambridge, Ted introduced me to his friend Carol Beckwith, and it was through Carol later that month that I met my future wife, Galen McClanahan. Around this time, too, I received notice that a group of my poems that had appeared in poetry had been chosen for the inaugural volume of the new annual, the American Literary Anthology, sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts. The two out of the three poetry judges for the anthology, Robert Creeley and John Ashbery, had both chosen my poems, made a little stir, and may have triggered an invitation from Random House to put together a book. On the drive down to New York, where I would meet my editor, Christopher Cerf, I shared the back seat of Carol's VW Bug with Galen, who had just graduated from Goucher and happened to be visiting Carol, a college friend. I had an immediate sense that we might be a match. That summer, Galen and I became a couple and moved to an apartment on River Street in Cambridge. I worked at assembling the book, trying to understand how my minimalist works could be put into a coherent sequence. Eventually, I discovered that there was a fundamental difference between a short poem, which involved a reading process, and a one-word poem, which had no reading process and could be seen entire instantaneously. And this discovery gave me an organizational template for the book, which would move from linear into instant electric poems, as I thought of them. It wasn't long after this that I stopped writing entirely. I had come to the end of something, and it would be another 5 years before I started again. By then, the late summer of 1972, Galen and I had gotten married, become the parents of an infant daughter, and moved to Bolinas, a small town in Northern California, where a number of poet friends had already settled, including Tom Clark, his wife Angelica, and their little daughter. So that's how all this kind of came to happen. And I'll close with a couple of the far end of the spectrum. Or maybe just a few more. This is London. The London in that little narrative. I sleep around the pillow in the light yellow morning, a member of the avant-garde. Song. My fathers, my mothers, my sisters, I'm. And, you know, most of these are hard to read. The longer one, I'll give you a little taste of one longer one, and I'll close with that. Crickets, 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 crickets. Crickets, 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 crickets. It was meant to be a homage to Barnett Newman. You know those big paintings with the zip down on the right side? Crickets. Thank you.
The first edition was like in 2008, right?
2007.
2007.
Then it got a review in the New York Times in 2008. And it went into an immediate second printing because they gave it a good review. And then I guess it sold out, and the reissue is primary information and Ugly Duckling Presse.
Oh, right, yeah.
Primary information did the tote bag.
It's a nice tote bag. It's a beautiful book, too. I mean, it's like art. But
They
so
did
I
a great book.
I'm curious what you think is responsible for the resurgence at this time. I mean, it's great poetry, so I understand why it's popular again, but you had mentioned before that it might have something to do with the internet.
I'm sure it does.
Do you think just like short form
writing
is just more popular?
I mean, when I first got online, I was, you know, sort of equally abashed and also thrilled that the two Random House books that I did in 68 and 69 were online in their entirety. And I immediately thought, well, I should sue, you know, and then I realized that they were generating interest in the work that exceeded anything that had happened at the time, although the book had made a splash. I mean, the initial books with Random House had kind of thrown everyone for a loop. Edwin Newman on the 6 o'clock news in New York read both books from cover to cover on the news. It was a put down, but it was it was unprecedented, you know. And like John Ashbery wrote about it, he said, since the media is apt to run from put down to panegyric without an interval of straight reportage, we may soon be seeing Aram Saroyan on the Johnny Carson show with Andy Warhol and the rest of the avant-garde. You know, I was like 24 and I was like, what? You know.
But so it doesn't bother you anymore that your work is readily available online, or?
No, it's created more interest, and the
Yeah.
books are actually, the books are interesting as, you know, books.
Yeah.
That you can't get that with
The
with
tactile
internet.
experience of holding a book, yeah.
Yeah.
It's very different because I've looked at both. I mean, I read your whole book in, a couple hours. And then I went,
A lot of
online.
times it's like 15 minutes.
Yeah, right. Well, I really ruminated on them. There's some beautiful, you want to know my favorite from that book is We Made a Raincoat for a Bee.
And that's a
Why? It's my
ready-made.
favorite.
Well,
Is that
that's,
ready-made?
it's a ready-made in the
Okay.
sense that, it was the period of Warhol and Duchamp and people who were just grabbing things out of the newspapers, and this was an ad somewhere.
Wow.
And then there's that one, had West followed up her fine opening lead by dropping the club king or queen on the second round of clubs, she would have been able to play the 10 when Stayman tried to throw her in. Then East could have overtaken and returned to Hart, wrecking the contract. It's like the second paragraph of a bridge column in the New York Post.
How many I mean, if you had to estimate, how many would you say are ready-made? It's just out of curiosity.
Maybe, half a dozen,
Yeah.
not that many,
Yeah.
but it just gives you a sense of the freedom at that particular time. I mean, there were a lot of people who were making fun of Warhol, for instance. But now, and I wasn't really sure what to make of it, but if you see a Warhol in a museum, he's one of the greatest colorists that ever lived. I mean, the paintings of, the multiple image paintings, Elizabeth Taylor, or anything that he did was just, had the presence of anything else in the museum. And he was sort of, an aloof, kind of goofy character. I kept my distance. But,
Did you ever meet Andy Warhol?
yeah.
Yeah.
I was
In New York?
friends with Gerard Malanga, who was his assistant. And, Andy was sort of a low wattage guy who just became the best known artist of the day. So it's paradoxical. He's very interesting. I mean, what he did, and I don't think he did it with consciously or intellectually, but when you put the same image 8 times, 4 on top, 4 below, and maybe vary the color slightly, but the image is the same, like in the self-portrait or Elizabeth Taylor or Marilyn Monroe, it basically is an illustration of what McLuhan talks about, electric structure. In the previous book era, you couldn't have the same thing in 2 different places at the same time. But when television took over, you had the Ed Sullivan Show in millions of homes all across America at the same time. So it was a shift. And he kind of just intuitively explored it, He's an amazing artist.
It's definitely analogous to what you were doing with concrete poetry at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I was influenced by him. I was influenced by Donald Judd, who's a sculptor who does multiple boxes, same size, up and down a wall or across a wall. And he said, I was trying to make something that you could see all at once. And if you look at them now, they're beautiful. At the time, I didn't know what it was about, but I knew there was some compelling presence in it. I remember being very disappointed. Ashbery came to Harvard to read when I was at Cambridge. I went to see him and I said, well, what about Donald Judd? What do you think? What is he doing? he said, well, the whole point is she's not doing anything. Which I thought was a terrible cop-out.
It's not easy, though, what you do. To get something to communicate immediately like that, which is what you're doing with the alphabet in a very short space.
Well, thank you.
I mean, I wouldn't say that's nothing. You know.
Well, we can't.
You
well,
wrote
we,
the most expensive word in history, so that's at least some
that
dollars.
was the L-I-G. It's the word light in lowercase with an extra G-H in it. L-I-G-H-G-H-T. And Robert Duncan, who's a wonderful poet, chose it for an NEA award. So I got $500, and the Chicago Review, who published it, got $250. And a guy in Congress brought it up and said, this is a misuse of public funds at the rate of $107.35 a letter. And then they then cut the arts budget several $1 million. That's the most expensive part. It's not the $750, you know. But it's crazy. And it was funny because Jesse Helms was involved and so on. And a few years later, I ran into Robert Duncan. And he said to me, we were taking a bus from Berkeley into San Francisco, and he said, you know, he said, that year you had some other poems that were more traditional, and I might have chosen any one of those, but an angel told me to choose light. I thought, gee, I wish he'd given a press conference.
Does anyone have any questions they want to ask?
I thought that the line about the line not being descriptive referred to Franz Klein. And
Yeah, because in an abstract painting, you know, like Klein does the big abstracts that are black paint on white, you know, and then he'll call it Merritt Parkway or something, but really it's not a description, it's a state that, you know, looking at that. I mean, I remember seeing those in the Museum of Modern Art and thinking, this guy has really gone out of his way to make something ugly. And I just didn't get it. And then, you know, 20 years later, I thought, these are the most elegant paintings. You know, so sometimes it takes a while for it to get to you.
And it takes you a while.
Takes me a while.
no, they say that the first.
I know you were right on it, Paul. Right?
No, they say that the first generation looks at new art as horrible. The second generation finds it funny, and the third finds it beautiful.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which generation?
Each generation,
How
every
fast
10
is it?
years.
Every 10 years.
Yeah.
Wow. So we're like in stage 5
Well, of what?
since. Well, when was Light written? For instance?
Well, that was in '65, but remember, it was the '60s, and we had a lot of permission. We had a lot of permission. Now you have a lockdown going on, like with this new formalism and all this stuff. You know, it's like, well, we've got to get back to iambic pentameter, and you know. Nobody cares, first of all. But, you know, the modernists, like Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams and those people, they were doing amazing stuff. And they also had incredibly good ears. Like you take a little couplet by Ezra Pound, it goes, it's not rhymed, or it's an off rhyme. It goes, "Foo, I love the high cloud and the hill. Alas, he died of alcohol." Well, almost every syllable of that thing is rhymed with other syllables. You know, I mean, these guys were not slouches.
That's really good. Does anyone else have any questions on it?
What is your relationship with these poems now? Like, well, how do you think of them?
Well, now I'm really flattered that people like them enough to, and I think the reprint, I asked the guy who originally said, let's do this poetry again or reprint it. I said, well, where did you first come across it? Because I was thinking maybe the internet. And he said, no, he came across a copy of the second book I did with Random House, which is in complete minimal poems, called Pages. And so it was nice
Was
to
that
hear.
Matt Bay Yankelevich from Ugly Duckling?
No, it was James Hoff, who at that time was working for Ugly Duckling.
Oh, okay. And he didn't know you, he just wanted to print.
No, he didn't know me. He reprinted Vito Aconsi's magazine, 0 to 9, that I had some stuff in, and that's how we kind of got to know each other. And but there are these young people, and they're not affiliated with the New York school, Ron Padgett or those people that I came up with, my generation. I don't quite know where they relate, but they relate to concrete poetry, and they, you know, it's interesting how things develop.
Mm-hmm.
Aram, do you feel now, because I've obviously read you on the internet, and it's to me, it's very exciting, because it has an immediacy that even a book does not have, because you're not expecting it. You know, you go on the internet and there's something from Aram, you know, and then, wow.
You're talking about the essays or the book or the
I'm
poems?
talking about the poems.
Well, I think
And
it's
is
a
there-
great
I mean,
medium.
and the exposure is so enormous. The contact with the public is so enormous that books cannot touch it.
It's
How
very
do you feel
different.
about that?
I mean, there's all kinds of things going on. Not only are there ebooks, where if you have a title that's out of print, you can put it back into print yourself, put it on Amazon and Nook, and if you charge $2.99 for it, you get, instead of getting the standard 10 to 15% royalty, you get 70%. So if a book that I have online or an ebook sells for $2.99, I get $2. It's an incredible deal. I mean, Amazon's going crazy right now, not permitting this publisher who published a critical biography of Jeff Bezos to sell their books. They're really being bullied. But it's an amazing medium, and who's to say what's going to happen? I think publishers are just waiting for the other shoe to drop. I mean, who's going to take on a first novel or a book of poems at this point? You know, other than a university press or somebody just devoted to it out of love, which luckily we have those.
I've heard that before, that publishers are less of interest. I think Andre Dubus said that in one of his essays, that publishers used to try an author out on the first book and expect to take losses, and then the second book is where they would make up for the losses on their investment.
And you
And
would
that
have an
that's
editor.
unheard of now. And you
I
would have
mean,
an editor,
For
which is huge.
Fitzgerald
for
and Hemingway had Maxwell Perkins and Scribners throughout their entire career. Well, there are very few writers who have an editor more than once or maybe twice.
Did you have, when your first book, you were first published in Poetry Magazine, but your first book you had an editor. Had you had an
Christopher
editor?
Cerf.
Had you had an editor before that, or how much of an influence was he? I'm going to let you ask your question, sorry. I just wanted to...
Well, Chris Cerf was, he took me on, and then he said, okay, well, you put the book together. And my big fear was I was going to put together a book that would be like a novelty item, and they'd sell it as sort of cartoony and so on and so forth. And I went in to meet the designers at Random House, and one guy showed up with a little piece of paper with 3 typefaces tried out on it. I thought, wow, these guys are not interested at all, which is kind of okay. And I designed the Random House books, which are typewriter face. One is actually, the first one is actually the size of a typewriter page, Aram Saroyan. And then the second one is smaller, 8.5 by 5.5 or something.
No, it was your choice to do it with the typewriter?
Yeah, I really designed it. And I made, I think, a grievous error, because I mean, in retrospect, you know, I put poems on just right-hand pages. Because my idea was, okay, a reader will be able to see the poem really clearly and not be distracted by the opposite page. And in fact, if you put a poem on a right-hand page and there's nothing on the left-hand page, your immediate impulse is to turn the page because you're looking for some kind of closure and some kind of equilibrium. And it doesn't happen.
The asymmetry of it is distracting.
It turns it into a narrative, oddly enough. And, which,
Yeah, like a flip book or something like
yeah.
that. Yeah.
So that was a huge error. Later I thought, oh, this is fine. But you know, what James Hoff and what the reprint allowed me to do was to put it together on both sides of the page. So that was, and the response was very heartening. It was like, oh, they could see it.
Yeah. You had a question
It's
that I...
funny you would say that because I have another question. But in Axe Handles, Gary Snyder had asked to do the very same thing, to just do the page on the right.
Oh,
And
really?
he told them that they would never sell the book. If they ever opened and only looked at a blank page,
That's
they'd never buy
interesting.
the book.
Yeah.
But what I was going to ask you is, you've succeeded a lot of writers that were dead long before the internet. But if someone had ever really been able to express to you in 67, 68, 69, that the internet was going to be, and that the access was going to be what it was, would that have influenced your writing? And if so, yes, no? I mean, I'm curious.
I don't know, but I mean, you know, it was, I don't think I could have imagined it. You know? It's so interesting. I mean, Facebook is very interesting. Yeah, I know you're not supposed to be on Facebook and stuff, but I look at the news feed and I find these interesting things on it. Like today, there was a great picture of the 3 stars of Mod Squad, which was my favorite. My favorite TV show. It's just so great to see that. You know, you never see it. I confess.
When did you get on the internet? You mentioned it earlier and I didn't know.
Well, it was like, you know, mid or late mid 90s.
Okay.
You know.
I was just curious. I was curious to know when if you were like holding out, you know, if you were a Luddite or...
No, I wanted to. Actually, what
Some people are.
The
Yeah.
word processing thing is fascinating because it allows you to keep files